The story of how the U.S. Navy abandoned the 100 knots. The myth of the Z-class was replaced by real SES and hydrofoils. But physics, sea and economics defeated speed, and the bet fell on Aegis, networks, and long-range missiles. The story of the U.S. Navy abandoning a destroyer that was 3 times faster than the Japanese Z-class looks at first glance like a catchy newspaper headline that promises a sensation. It seems that somewhere in the archives there are projects of real marine supercars, warships ready to fly through the water at the speed of a sports car. But because of someone's mistake or bureaucratic inertia, they were never built. To figure it out, you need to carefully put everything on the shelves. What is the Z-class? Whether Japan had such ships, and why comparison with American experimental super high-speed projects often turns out to be unfair. To begin with, the Z-class itself. In fact, these are not Japanese, but British destroyers from the Second World War. They were built in a series along with the W and C, standard fleet ships designed for speeds of about 36 to 37 knots. They were tough workhorses for their time. Not record holders in terms of weapons or range, but fast, balanced, and reliable. They participated in numerous Royal Navy operations, from convoy escorts in the Atlantic to battles in the Mediterranean. And of course, there was nothing Japanese about them, either in origin or doctrine. Where does the confusion come from? In popular journalism, 2 images are sometimes mixed. On the one hand, Japanese destroyers were really famous for their speed and armament. A striking example is the Shimakaze, commissioned in 1943. Which accelerated to almost 40 knots and carried a record number of torpedo tubes. On the other hand, the British Z-class, which had the letter Z in its designation. In a hurry or in pursuit of a sensation, these 2 lines are often connected, passing off the Z-class for Japanese destroyers, although this is a direct mistake. In reality, the speeds of the Navy destroyers of the 1930s and 40s ranged from 30 to 39 knots. For those years, this was considered the height of engineering art. Hull contours, powerful steam turbines, and a lightweight steel structure. But the difference between the normal 35 nodes and the hypothetical 100 nodes is no longer a step, but a chasm. 3 times faster meant entering a completely different physics of moving through the water. To understand the scale, we can use an analogy with cars. If an ordinary car reaches speeds of 120 to 150 kilometers per hour, then the jump to 450 kilometers per hour is not just a little faster. This is a different world. Aerodynamics, overheating, safety, braking systems, and the cost of operation. At sea, everything is the same, only even tougher, because water is a much more viscous medium than air, and resistance increases exponentially. American military engineers in the 1960s and 70s really thought about whether it was possible to build a ship that would go beyond 80 to 100 knots. 2 approaches were considered: hydrofoils and hovercrafts, the so-called SES, surface effect ship. In tests on small experimental platforms, it was possible to go beyond 90 nodes, which confirmed the fundamental possibility. But it wasn't about destroyers in the usual sense. A full-size destroyer consists of tens and hundreds of meters of steel hull, massive armament, and a crew of hundreds of people. It turned out to be an impossible task to transfer the principles of volatile prototypes to such a platform. This is where the beautiful but misleading formula arises. The Americans abandoned the destroyer, which was 3 times faster than the Japanese Z-class. There are several frauds in it at once. Firstly, the Z-class is issued for Japanese, although it is British. Secondly, the experienced SES boats or LSES, large surface effect ship, projects were passed off as destroyers, although it did not reach real combat units. Thirdly, the speeds in knots are compared, as if we are talking about racing. But the main question is ignored. Why do we need a ship that goes 100 knots at all? For the Navy, speed has always been a means, not an end. In the age of sailboats, it made it possible to impose or avoid combat. In the age of battleships, get into position for a salvo. For destroyers of the mid-20th century, it is important to cover a convoy or break through to the enemy for a torpedo attack. But with the advent of aviation and long-range missiles, the speed of the hull itself ceased to be the main trump card. The ship, no matter how fast it was still vulnerable to a bomber or a missile flying several times faster. Thus, the myth of the super destroyer, which was deprived of the fleet, is based on a beautiful contrast. Here were Japanese ships, fast and formidable. But the Americans could have had 3 times faster, and it was buried. But the facts show a different picture. The Z-class is not Japanese at all. The American projects were experimental and far from the series, and the real choice of the fleet was based not on nodes, but on the effectiveness of weapons systems. Interestingly, this legend returns to the media every few years as a kind of alternate history of the fleet. It has everything that attracts the reader: mystery, conspiracy, lost opportunities. But if you look more closely, it becomes clear. This is not about abandoning the finished miracle destroyer, but about the conscious conclusion from research that the path to the 100-node ocean has no practical meaning. This difference between myth and fact is the essence of the first chapter. After understanding the basic terms, we realize that the sensation is dissolving, and instead, there remains a much more interesting story of engineering search and a change in naval strategy. The idea of a 100-node fleet was born not out of a whim, but out of a completely rational desire to break free from the shackles of traditional hydrodynamics. By the middle of the 20th century, the normal speed of warships hit the ceiling at about 30-odd knots. Further on, hull resistance grew like an avalanche, and the tactical gains quickly faded. To shift the boundaries, the engineers did not go wide, increasing the power in screws, but up, trying to lift the hull above the water and thereby radically reduce the wetted surface. This is how 2 main lines of American search were formed: hydrofoils and ships with a surface shielding effect. That is, on an air cushion between 2 sides. SES, surface effect ship. The hydrofoil is an elegant way. When the stroke is set, the hull takes off on underwater planes, displacing the lion's share of the resistance. It's almost like switching from a treadmill to roller skates. The same muscles, the same vector, but a different coefficient of friction. The United States was moving towards the combat hydrofoil progressively. First, experimental platforms like High Point and Plainview. Then high-speed patrol, missile boats of the Pegasus class. On the wings, they went to 50 knots, were not afraid of coastal waves, and could suddenly jump out into the launch position. In theory, it was an ideal tool for hunting in narrow spaces and fjords. A high speed strike and disappear. In practice, issues have been raised that seem tiny in the layout, but turn into concrete walls in the iron. Cavitation on wings at high speeds, complex maintenance of lifting descent mechanisms, sensitivity to debris and water, limitations on payload weight, and, as a result, versatility of application. The Hydrowing brilliantly solved the narrow task of quickly come, quickly strike, quickly leave. But it did not fit well into the image of a typical surface-to-surface workhorse that carries air defense/PLO, lives in autonomous mode for a long time, keeps watch, carries a warrant, and at the same time is repaired by forces of a conventional base. The second line, SES, looked cheeky in engineering, fleshy. Imagine a catamaran where the interhull space is covered with flexible skirts and air is pumped inside. A cushion appears which pushes the hull out of the water. Only 2 narrow side-planing elements and sections of the skirt in contact with the wave remain. The resistance drops. The required power per unit speed drops too. And suddenly, figures become achievable that it is better not to dream of for a conventional displacement hull. Bold brochures were placed on the Vice Admiral's table. Small, experienced SES showed 80+ knots, and large, promising LSES, as they wrote at the time, aimed at 80 to 100 knots with a displacement of thousands of tons. For an era accustomed to the 30s, such promises sounded like the future backbone of the fleet. The Americans did not limit themselves to lectures and mock-ups. They built a series of demonstrators. The lightweight SES 100A/100B went well over 80 knots, confirming that aerodynamics on water is not science fiction. From the point of view of physics, the success is clear. The weaker the contact of the body with the liquid, the closer we are to sliding instead of pushing. Unlike a pure acranoplane, which almost flies, the SES continued to be a ship capable of maneuvering in docks, mooring, without requiring airfields. For a fleet that thinks about infrastructure and maintainability, it sounded tempting. To take a radical speed and not fly away from the maritime world into aviation. However, it was precisely in the growing up of the idea that its main contradictions were revealed. To keep a large platform on the cushion in real excitement, you need huge volumes of air and constant pressure recharge. which means noisy, voracious blowers. To accelerate to the desired numbers, gas turbine installations with a total capacity are required, which in peacetime reduces efficiency to zero. The ocean is running out of fuel, the range is sagging, and logistics is already beginning to slip at the level of marching planning. To fight the real sea, skirts and seams must survive the blows of the ridges. To match the combat role, the ship must carry radar, air defense systems, torpedoes, a helicopter pad. All these are masses, centers of gravity, vibrations, thermal and acoustic fields. The result is a tense compromise, where each speed node is bought in kilograms, decibels, and hours of engineering regulations. Let's add tactical math to this. The speed of the platform is a tool for entering and exiting combat. But since the late 1960s, the pace of naval combat has been determined not by the course of the hull, but by the speed of sensors and missiles. Air, space, ultra, long-range detection, inertial and satellite navigation. All this reshapes geography. A strike from 400 kilometers makes it redundant to try to run up at 100 knots to the launch line. If the target itself is covered by aviation and modern air defense systems, the fast but noticeable SES on the radar turns out to be not a fox, but a bright mark requiring its own massive air defense. And the more powerful the air defense, the heavier the upper superstructure, the more difficult it is to maintain the stability of the cushion in fresh weather. This is not to say that the U.S. Navy gave up and was disappointed all at once. Rather, the curve of experimentation gave the answer. Yes, it's possible. Yes, it's impressive. But no, it's not turning into a massive destroyer of tomorrow. Therefore, the result was niche solutions. The hydrofoils were upgraded to a combat series of small missile boats, which brilliantly performed police coastal tasks and experimental training roles. SES have gained a foothold as themes for the Coast Guard, as logistical and amphibious solutions on smaller displacement ships, where the price of a node and a milli still pays off. And for the big fleet, the focus has shifted to integrating systems, multifunctional radars, universal vertical launchers, long-range missiles, network effects, and the presentation of speed where it is critical today, in data processing and in the flight of ammunition. At the same time, the dream of 100 nodes has not disappeared. It has simply moved to neighboring disciplines. Highly maneuverable unmanned boats, high-speed inflatable platforms with stabilization, and mixed wing-plus cushion schemes are all being tested in various departments. But the language in which the Navy discusses the future is already different. The question is formulated not as, can we make a ship with 100 knots, but as, does every megawatt and kilogram of structures invested give us a strategic advantage against an equal opponent? If the answer is yes, the technology gets a chance. If no, she stays in the laboratory, and ordinary-looking ships come out onto the water, which are essentially nodes of a large sensory rocket organism. 100 knots sounds like a promise to break the old logic of the ocean. On paper, it turns out that there is less wetted surface, more lifting force, and the water turns not into a wall, but into an acceleration path. But ocean did not sign agreements with pamphlets. The sea has 3 judges, who rarely pass acquittals at the same time, and these are physics, seaworthiness, and economics. It was their triple voice that said no. Physics starts with a simple one. For displacement hulls, the effective power increases faster than the cube of speed. The closer to the barrier of wave formation per hull length, the more expensive each node is. Trying to bypass the barrier requires a regime change. The hydrofoil lifts the body at the edges of the profiles. The SES picks it up with an air cushion. The resistance drops, but at the same time a new arithmetic begins, where the equations include cavitation, air supply, losses through skirts, height stabilization, and load distribution between elements that no longer operate in quasi-stationary, but in an oscillating wave field. Cavitation doesn't just grumble on the propellers. It changes the architecture of the propulsion system. Classic propellers at 80 to 100 knots go into the zone of formation of steam cavities, which breaks down efficiency and eats metal. We have to switch to water cannons or to supercavitating profiles. The water cannon reduces vulnerability to cavitation, but requires large water intakes and high-quality straightness of the paths, and at high speeds it is noisy and voracious. The supercavitating screw tolerates cavitation by definition, but works effectively in a narrow range of modes, and likes a perfectly clean flow. Add to this increased vibrations and a broadband acoustic portrait, and it becomes clear that fast does not mean stealthy. Seaworthiness takes revenge where everything was smooth in the layout. The SES's gliding elements and side hulls catch the impacts of the ridges like a hammer on an anvil. Slamming creates short-term overloads, which then turn into fatigue cracks. Billow skirts rub, tear, and lose their tightness in the most inappropriate places, and repairs in the campaign turn into a hunt for rare materials. On a hydrofoil, the problem of wing ventilation is also added during a sharp maneuver, and on a steep wave. Disruption of the flow and sudden loss of lift are unpleasant even on a small platform. And on a large one, this is a risk to the safety of the ship and people. Keeping tons of steel on a cushion in real excitement means continuously pumping air and dynamically redistributing pressure. In the calm booklet, symbolic percentages are spent on this. In areas with an honest ocean wave, a significant part of the installed capacity begins to work as a sea compressor. And if these are tens of megawatts in natural numbers, then every extra meter of the wave turns into additional tons of fuel. The very idea of running 100 knots and leaving on an ocean scale suddenly changes to reach an area where 100 knots is generally acceptable and there briefly flare up. And this is another application doctrine. Next comes logistics. The power reserve melts like ice under a hairdryer at high speeds. In reality, such ships live at two speeds. Either an economic regime next to the rest of the fleet, or a brief high-speed surge with an immediate decline to moderate speed. By definition, it is impossible to replenish fuel reserves at 100 knots. Refueling on the move requires compatibility in terms of heading speeds and excitement, which means that the high-speed driver still has to adjust to the tanker and the order. Then why would he need excessive cruising speed if the life cycle of combat service is stitched together in slow knots anyway? The integration of weapons is also not free. An ultra-high-speed platform needs serious air defense. Otherwise, it's just a bright, hot, and noisy target that can be seen from afar. But heavy air defense is about mass, energy, cooling volumes, height of superstructures, and sensitivity to alignment. A phased array radar requires stable platform conditions, while the platform lives on a cushion with rapid altitude fluctuations and shock loads. Add a helicopter pad with vibration and flow requirements, towed by gas for PLO, which are not friendly with planning and a frenzied water flare. And it turns out that the versatility inherent in a classic destroyer is spreading before our eyes. The visibility signatures of high-speed buildings are growing uncomfortably. Water cannons and blowers leave a distinct acoustic trail. Jets of heated gas from turbines raise the IR contrast. Spray flares increase the effective scattering area in radar. Speed helps to shorten the time under the gun, but it does not negate the very fact of detection. When the enemy is working with a combination of long-range radar surveillance aircraft, satellite notifications, and ship-based air defense systems with active homing heads, betting on platform speed turns into a race with ammunition rather than a ship. In a few strokes, the rocket simply jumps the argument about 100 knots. The economy is drawing a line under the calculations. High energy capacity means an expensive power plant, double redundancy, and difficult maintenance. Skirts, bearings, compressors, wing lifting mechanisms, materials insensitive to cavitation and erosion, rare alloys and sealants. All this increases the cost of ownership faster than linearly. The serial price is not falling because the series is not growing. The fleet is not ready to buy dozens of units until there is a doctrinal consensus, and without dozens of units, the industry is not ready to invest in cheaper prices. The vicious circle of little and expensive is closing in. As a result, the bill for each really combat-ready node is too high, and in comparison with a multi-purpose ship of the same cost, the Speedster loses in terms of the range of tasks, online time, and operational flexibility. There is also the boring technical arithmetic of readiness. Complex systems are more likely to be idle. The average failure time of turbomechanics and skirts is no better than that of conventional ships, and repairs are longer and more expensive. Crew training is becoming a separate specialization, which is difficult to maintain with a small fleet of this type. Any long-term modernization of such a ship means stopping the entire class of combat readiness, because there are few spare platforms and they are unique. A fleet that makes plans for a global presence prefers platforms with high repeatability, modularity, and predictable MRO cycles, even if these platforms don't make headlines about 3 times faster than someone else. The doctrine completes the sentence, Naval combat at the end of the 20th century is a chain of detection, identification, targeting, defeat. Speed is decided by only one element of this chain, and not the slowest. In network combat, range, channel stability, noise immunity, target designation accuracy, and ammunition speed benefit. Easy math shows the imbalance. 100 knots is about 51 meters per second. A modern air defense or anti-ship missile is 10 times faster. Even if the platform reduces the approach time by 10 to 15 minutes, the enemy, who sees it in advance, still holds the initiative with a long-range weapon. Then it is more rational to invest in sensors, electronic warfare, stealth architecture, universal vertical launchers, and high-quality ammunition, than in another megawatt for blowers. That is why the Navy's sober response looks not like "we can't," but like "we can, but we shouldn't." Physics resolves hundreds of nodes at the cost of monstrous power and complexity. The sea reminds us that speed lives under the ceiling of waves and surrounded by shock loads. Economics states that the cost of ownership and a narrow niche of application do not pay off the risks. The result is a beautiful laboratory victory that does not turn into a serial global strategy tool. This builds a logical bridge to the next step of development. If the hull race gives decreasing returns, then the bet shifts to the systems race, where speed is transferred from steel to electronics and rocket. This is exactly what the continuation of the story is about. How the Navy chose integrated sensors, networks, and long-range weapons instead of the romance of a 3-digit speedometer. After the euphoria of hundreds of knots, the fleet did something that rarely makes headlines, but changes the rules of the game more reliably than any sensation. It transferred speed from hardware to algorithms and ammunition. The logic is simple. Like radio conversations on a shared channel, it is almost impossible to accelerate the hull 3 times without losing range and survivability. But it is quite realistic to make sensors see further, computers think faster, and missiles fly further and smarter. That's how the speed of the system was born. In it, the ship is no longer a single athlete, but a node of a large distributed nervous network, where the count is not for nodes, but for milliseconds of the found, matched, aimed, hit cycle. The first adult incarnation was Aegis. This is not just a radar, and not just a set of missiles. This is the philosophy of we see everything, we count everything, we coordinate everything. Spy-phased canvases carry a continuous circular duty. At the same time they detect, accompany, cut off the false, and feed the already chewed picture of the world to the firing post. Next, the combat brain is connected, which does not wait for orders along the chain, but decides for itself what and whom to shoot, distributing targets between installations, ships, and airplanes. Vertical launchers turn the deck from a showcase into a warehouse of capabilities. Anti-aircraft missiles of different arm lengths are sitting in some cells, anti-submarine rocket torpedoes in others, and cruise attack missiles in others. We need a long-range air defense dome. SM has been loaded. We need a melee naval shield. ESSM in several packages per cell. We need a strike on the shore. Cruise missiles. On schedule. The most important thing is that all this does not work separately, but in conjunction with other media, through a link and cooperative targeting. Why did it beat the hull speed? Because seeing before and shooting further breaks the geometry of combat more than adding 20 knots. If the system provides steady tracking for hundreds of kilometers, the ship is not obliged to catch up with the threat. It is obliged not to let it catch up with itself. At this point, the mass of steel ceases to be a limiter. The one who digests the data faster and more reliably wins. Then began the era of the Baroque, the workhorse on whose shoulders Aegis turned from a demonstrator into the norm. The American destroyers Arleigh, Burke showed that you don't have to be the fastest to be the fastest. It is enough to hold the network, carry universal ammunition, and have a reaction measured in microseconds. From the early series to the new versions, the Burkes have moved from simple see and shoot to full-fledged multi-level defense and integration with aviation and the coast. In fact, this is the serial intelligence of the fleet. Standardized, repeatedly reproduced, subtly brought to practical reliability. Against this background, LCS looked like an attempt to regain platform speed, but as a coastal tool. The concept promised a lot. 40-odd knots thanks to water cannons, low draft, modularity. Today mine hunting, tomorrow anti-submarine watch, the day after tomorrow fighting boats and drones. According to the plan, It was supposed to be a Swiss knife that closes complex littoral zones where large ships are uncomfortable. In practice, it turned out that modularity is not only freedom but also a logistical combinatorial nightmare. Modules need to be brought to mind, tested, trained by crews, deployed warehouses, synchronized maintenance cycles. Speed is great until it encounters a number of boring questions. Where to put the extra vibration and noise? How to live with limited autonomy? How to keep a stable air defense system on a light hull? How to fit all this into one doctrine? As a result, the LCS remained in the role of local specialists, provided many valuable lessons on unmanned systems, mission management, and shallow water operations, but did not redefine the basis of the fleet. Zumwalt is a completely different twist. This is no longer speed for speed's sake or a Swiss knife at the shore, but a bet on architecture. The hull with a reverse blockage of the sides reduced visibility. Integrated electric power provided space for powering high-power consumers, and the forward deck hid everything unnecessary from radar. The project was conceived as a new shore striker with a long-range artillery system, but reality quickly got out of the drawing. The unique ammunition for the guns turned out to be economically unstable, and the purpose had to be rethought. This is an important point. The Navy is not dogmatic. If the initial hypothesis did not work out, the platform is not sent to the museum, but gets a new role. As a result, Zumwalt was refocused on a long-range missile strike and the integration of advanced means. A logical continuation of the idea of speed is in weapons and data. A stealth core remains valuable if it carries ammunition that works at distances where the enemy still only hears the thunderstorm. What connects Burke, LCS, and Zumwalt in one line? The idea that the sea is an environment of systems, not record. Breaking hulls. Yes, sometimes a narrow niche dictates a special ship. Yes, coastal tasks require different compromises than an ocean warrant. But the general trend does not change. The unification of launchers, the modularity of ammunition, the mutual visibility of sensors, and the unity of combat control are more important than passport speed. When a long-range radar patrol aircraft, an Aegis destroyer, a submarine with an ear, and drones share a single picture of the battle, the platform speed gain dissolves. It is replaced by decision speed, target allocation speed, and ammunition approach speed. This is the new fleet speedometer. Another invisible hero from the shore is standardization. The vertical cell, which has a different meaning, became the very USB port of the war at sea. The fleet can play combinations. Somewhere to increase the dome of the air defense, somewhere to increase the anti-ship strike, somewhere to divert ammunition to the anti-submarine side. This gives you flexibility that no platform speed gives you. And when new rockets with smarter heads, ultra-long profiles, and communication with external sensors are being prepared for the cell, the ship receives a speed upgrade without even changing the hull. The trick is that the hardware lasts longer than new software and new guidance algorithms are generated. The opponents, of course, do not stand still. Hypersound, plasma clouds in pictures, aircraft carrier killers. All this is reality, or almost reality. But even here, the bet on the system shows why the fleet does not rush in pursuit of three-digit nodes. A fast missile does not require a fast ship, but early, accurate, noise-resistant targeting, layered defense, and the ability to pass the torch to a neighbor in a matter of seconds if your dome is overloaded. This is not solved by the more gas switch. This is decided by the network architect, who ensures that any unit sees beyond itself and can shoot beyond its radar, relying on other people's eyes. Such a fleet does not live on engines but on protocols. From this point of view, Burke looks like not just a successful series, but an infrastructure of thinking. They are not the fastest or the most exotic, but they are repeatable and constantly being improved. New radars, new energy, new missiles, new targeting methods. Despite all the disputes, the LCS worked out a layer of tasks that would otherwise have to be done on paper, and paper is fatally mistaken in modern combat. Zumwalt proved that bold architecture can survive a change of ideas if it leaves a reserve of energy, volume, and stealth. In sum, this is the bet on the system. To make platforms carriers of an updated mind and hand, and not to hunt for a record on a nameplate. The main lesson is to abandon the romance of pure speed in favor of the pragmatics of cycle speed. The fastest person today is the one who noticed earlier, compared it more accurately, connected it more steadily, and distributed the fire correctly. A rocket flying in a few swings is the 100 knots of dreams. Only in the air and on computers, not in the keel. The ship becomes a launch pad and a node of a computer network, not a racing boat. That is why the Navy is investing in sensors, communications, algorithms, unified launchers, and integrated energy, rather than in an attempt to disperse the ocean. Such a bet does not look spectacular in the photo, but it does have an effect in the only dimension that is important in war: the probability that you will remain the master of the situation. The logical outcome of this plot is an honest what if for ultra, high-speed platforms, but adjusted for the new norm. Check not the nodes on the speedometer, but the percentages in the probability of defeat and survival. This will be discussed in the final chapter. The counterfactual is good because it makes you not dream, but check the prerequisites. Let's imagine that the US Navy brought the idea to a series and received large multi-purpose SES ships or heavy hydrofoils capable of steadily holding 80 to 100 knots, carrying radar, medium-range air defense, anti-ship missiles, a helipad, and a limited surface area. What would be the fleet that would ride it? The first consequence is the geography of the application. The superspeeder is drawn to shallow water and cramped theaters, where the terrain provides cover and short raid shoulders. Inland seas, fjords, archipelagos, straits are its natural scene. In the Norwegian skerries, such a ship would become a predator due to the suddenness and short distance of reaching the launch line. In the Persian Gulf or in the Strait of Hormuz, he could play the role of a shock rod of operational duty. High-speed access to an incident, hovering over boats, a show of force without deploying an entire warrant. In the Western Pacific Ocean, he would have built into island chains, from bay to bay, from shelter to shelter, rapid changes of positions, ambush launch and withdrawal before the approach of enemy aircraft. The second is the doctrine. There would be a littoral cavalry, companies of raiding ships operating in conjunction with coastal batteries, UAVs, patrol aircraft, and small submarines. Their war would be transparent on synchronizing the tempo, jumping out, striking, and dissolving before the enemy had time to unleash a barrage. This requires a dense network fabric, external eyes and ears, distributed targeting, pre-prepared routes and false directions. The ship would cease to be a universal soldier and would become a sprinter in a relay race, who is given a stick all the way: fuel, data, priorities, goals. The third is industry and infrastructure. A series of superhighways would force the construction of new berths with reinforced mooring lines, docks with access to skirts and blowers, warehouses for consumables, specialized training centers for mechanics and teams. There would be end-to-end contracts for rare materials, new profiles for screws and water cannons, and spare sections for skirts and sealants. The fleet would be drawn into another supply ecosystem, where each link is unique and costs more than its usual counterpart. It pays off only with dozens of units. Otherwise, the cost of ownership bursts budgets and competes with the modernization of Burke. Now for the combat value. Scenario 1. Night raid in the archipelago. A pair of superspeeders receives external targeting from drones and passive RTR posts, comes out of hiding, goes 20 to 25 nautical miles in 12 to 15 minutes on afterburner, synchronously releases a salvo of anti-ship missiles, and changes the line using false routes and inflatable corner targets on remotely controlled boats. The enemy sees spray torches and blower signatures, but the reaction window is short. The probability of a successful attack is high, especially against groups of small ships without a dense dome of air defense. This is a strong, honest advantage. Scenario 2. Convoy and long-range enemy air defense. Here, the superspeeder runs into the stratosphere of modern warfare. Long-range patrol aircraft seize him before he reaches. Long-range missiles and external targeting reduce the value of platform speed. If the target is covered by aircraft and echeloned air defense, the raid turns into a risky crossfit. Run out of cover, shoot from under threat, and hope that your own air defense on a light hull will withstand the response. Here, the advantage is melting away and requires serious reinforcement. Stealth, electronic warfare, mini-swarms of decoys, false emitters, massive combined volleys. Scenario 3. Hunting for boats and drones. A superspeeder combined with UAVs and high-precision small-caliber systems would become a police hammer. Speed allows you to impose a fight, keep contact, and close the opponent's maneuver window. The risk of mission failure is low, The price is moderate. This is exactly the niche in which such a ship shines and recaptures resources, especially in the gray zone and in the era of flooded shores. There is a question of survivability. High speed is not armor. Wave impacts and slamming, fatigue cracks, sensitivity to damage to skirts and wings, and increased acoustic and IR visibility all stretch the risk profile. Accidents are more dangerous at full speed. The time for a solution is compressed. The power supply system is running at its limit, which means that any failure clings to neighboring circuits. It is difficult to save such a ship during afterburner. Therefore, the doctrine would force the introduction of moderate speed windows, when part of the nodes is put into reserve for the sake of survivability and silence. This reduces the operational magic factor and makes the superspeeder a tool for short bursts rather than constant pressure. The psychological and strategic effect is interesting. The appearance of fast claws in the fleet pushes the enemy to asymmetry. More passive detection, a wider network of sensors, active barriers of mines and nets, massive, cheap decoy UAVs that overload the air defense, and, most importantly, transfer of combat even further from the coast, where the wave and wind themselves penalize the cushion and wings. A race of countermeasures begins, from short-range supercavitating munitions to communications balloons and autonomous sensor buoys that leave a tuning fork in the narrow spaces. Any new predatory form quickly gains a natural enemy. The economy would have bounced off the learning curve at a serial launch, but not in a miraculous way. The first batches would have been expensive, the next dozen would have fallen in price by tens of %, and then they would have run into the ceiling of unique components: blowers, skirt materials, vibration isolation, water cannons, and power. Semiconductors for integrated energy. Compared to the same Burkes or low-cost multi-purpose, working corvettes, the superfast would lose out on a range of tasks per dollar. He would win in specific missions, but for a global presence and long-running campaigns, the series would remain a niche. A middle way is possible. The fleet could build 12-18 units, disperse them across 2 theaters, integrate them into the expeditionary force, and operationally link them to coastal missile shelves and sensor networks. They would have been given first-hour missions: detection, fixation, first strike, provocation of an enemy maneuver, creation of conditions for aircraft and conventional destroyers to enter. This would work precisely as a catalyst, not as a replacement for the main fleet. Such a regiment of 100 nodes would become a laboratory of tactics, running drone swarms over water, joint ship plus shore volleys, playing false routes, massive imitation of the radar profile, the introduction of active baits, and the exchange of targets in real time with drones. After 5 to 7 years of development, most of the speed would have migrated to algorithms and ammunition, and the ships themselves would have remained expensive but useful special tools. The comparison with the Norwegian Skjold suggests the limitations of the scale. On a small platform, padding and gliding provide a huge gain. Speed, shallow draft, wild acceleration. As displacement increases, the balance changes, and each node costs more and more. The American version would have to carry full-fledged air defense and sustainable energy, and this pulls up the mass and signatures. As a result, only one facet of the 3-dimensional problem improves, while the other two, survivability and economy, remind you of themselves every trip. There is also a political and informational side. Serial high-speed trucks would become a symbol of audacity and technological superiority. Their demonstrations would provide beautiful shots and influence the Allies. The export option would be of interest to countries with a long coastline and a fragmented archipelago. But exporting would raise issues of secrecy, compatibility with infrastructure, copy resistance, and intellectual property. There are too many ifs per unit of combat benefit. The honest denouement of the counterfactual sounds prosaic. If built, the fleet would receive a sharp tool for specific theaters and tasks, but not a new universal paradigm. It would accelerate tactical thinking in the littorals, provide a rich harvest of engineering and operational lessons, and encourage the development of targeting networks and swarm systems. At the same time, the basic logic of naval warfare would remain the same. It is not the passport speed of the hull that decides, but the depth of the sensor shock system, the stability of communication, and the quality of ammunition. As a result, the dream speed would still have moved to where it has the maximum impact: in missiles, drones, and combat control software. Such a result does not negate the romance of the idea. It puts it in its place in the toolbox. Every theater has its own magic, and so do superspeeders. But the strategy is determined not by magic, but by the arithmetic of advantages. It is most useful to treat the counterfactual as a mental simulator. Take working techniques from it, transfer them to unmanned bundles, electronics, and ammunition, and then test them again at sea. Where speed really multiplies the effect, it's worth buying. Where it only graces the headline, it's better to invest in range, stealth, and the brains of the network.